The rope slipped from Caleb Crawford's frozen fingers for the third time that morning, and he did not curse, did not shout, barely even acknowledge the burning scrape across his palm as the hemp tore free. He simply reached down, retrieved it from the snow-dusted ground, and began again with the same mechanical precision he applied to every task on the Crawford ranch. His father always said ice water ran in his veins instead of blood, and Caleb had stopped arguing the point years ago when he realized it was probably true. The February wind howled across the Idaho plains, carrying with it the bitter promise of another storm rolling down from the mountains that surrounded Challis. It was 1883, and the winter had been brutal even by the standards of men who had weathered many harsh seasons. Caleb worked alone in the corral, repairing the fence line that had buckled under the weight of ice and wind, his movements efficient but empty of any passion or fire. At 26 years old, he had become exactly what his father had shaped him to be. A man who could work from dawn until dusk without complaint, who could break a wild horse without raising his voice, who could run a ranch with cold competence. What he could not do was feel much of anything at all. His father had died the previous autumn, leaving Caleb the sprawling property and a legacy of silence. Thomas Crawford had been a hard man who believed emotions were weakness and sentiment was for fools. He had raised his only son after Caleb's mother passed from fever when the boy was just 8, and in the 18 years since, Caleb had learned to bury whatever warmth might have once existed in his heart. Now he lived alone in the ranch house, tended the cattle and horses with the help of 2 hired hands who came and went with the seasons, and moved through his days like a man walking through a dream he could not quite wake from. The sound of wagon wheels crunching over frozen ground pulled his attention from his work. Caleb straightened, watching as a covered wagon pulled by 2 exhausted-looking mules came up the long drive toward the main house. This was unusual. The Crawford Ranch sat a good 3 miles outside of Challis, and visitors were rare, especially in winter. He set down his tools and walked toward the approaching wagon, his boots leaving deep prints in the week-old snow. The wagon came to a halt near the barn, and Caleb saw that the driver was a woman, though her face was so wrapped in scarves against the cold that he could make out little of her features. What he could see were her hands on the reins, red and chapped from the cold, trembling slightly as she pulled the mules to a stop. "Help you?" Caleb asked, his voice flat and uninflected. The woman unwrapped the scarf from her face, and Caleb found himself looking at a young woman perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with dark hair that fell in wind-tangled waves around her shoulders and eyes the color of amber catching sunlight. Her face was pale from cold and exhaustion, but there was something in her expression that spoke of determination rather than defeat. "I hope so," she said, and her voice carried a slight tremor that might have been from the temperature or from something else entirely. "My name is Zara Winters. I am looking for work, and I was told in town that Thomas Crawford sometimes hired seasonal help." "Thomas Crawford is dead," Caleb said, the words carrying no more emotion than if he had been commenting on the weather. "I am his son, Caleb. I run the place now." Zara's face fell slightly, but she did not let despair take hold. "I am sorry for your loss. Might you be hiring? I can work with horses, cattle, whatever you need. I do not eat much, and I can sleep in the barn if necessary." Caleb studied her for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes taking in the threadbare quality of her coat, the wagon that looked like it had seen better decades, the mules that were clearly on their last reserves of strength. Everything about her situation spoke of desperation, and Caleb Crawford was not a man given to charity or sentiment. He should have sent her on her way, told her to try one of the other ranches closer to town. Instead, he heard himself saying, "I have a bunkhouse out back. It is not fancy, but it is warm and dry. You can stable your mules in the barn. Wages are $30 a month plus room and board. Work starts at dawn." The relief that washed over Zara's face was so profound that for just a moment, Caleb felt something stir in the frozen wasteland of his chest. But the feeling passed as quickly as it had come, and he turned away before she could thank him, already walking toward the barn to show her where she could put the mules. Zara climbed down from the wagon with visible effort, her legs stiff from what must have been hours of driving in the cold. She followed Caleb into the barn, leading the mules behind her, and as she stepped into the relative warmth of the structure, she let out a small sigh of relief. The barn was well maintained, with stalls lining both sides of a central aisle. A dozen horses occupied various stalls, their breath creating clouds of steam in the cold air. Caleb gestured to two empty stalls at the far end. "You can put them there. There is hay in the loft and grain in the bins by the door. Feed them light tonight since they look half-starved. Too much too fast will make them sick." "I know," Zara said quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. You do not know what this means." Caleb did not respond. He simply turned and walked back out into the cold, leaving Zara to tend to her animals. He had work to finish before dark, and the fence would not repair itself. Sentiment and gratitude were things that made him uncomfortable, emotions he did not know how to process or return. Better to avoid them entirely. But as he returned to his work on the fence line, Caleb found his thoughts drifting back to the woman in the barn. There had been something in her eyes, a spark of life and warmth that seemed almost foreign to him after so many years of cold isolation. He pushed the thoughts away with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to everything else, focusing instead on the physical task before him. Feelings were dangerous. His father had taught him that. Better to be ice than to risk the pain of melting. Inside the barn, Zara worked to settle her mules, speaking softly to them as she brushed away the road dust and ice that clung to their coats. The animals leaned into her touch, clearly trusting her completely. As she worked, she hummed a tune under her breath, something wordless and gentle that seemed to calm the mules further. The horses in the other stalls began to perk their ears, turning their attention toward the sound. One of them, a large bay gelding with a white star on his forehead, nickered softly. Zara smiled and moved to his stall once the mules were settled and eating. "Hello there, handsome," she murmured, extending her hand palm up for the horse to sniff. "What is your name?" The horse investigated her hand thoroughly, then blew warm air across her fingers in greeting. Zara laughed, the sound bright and genuine in the quiet barn. She reached up to stroke the horse's neck, and as she did, she began to sing. The song was an old one, something her mother had taught her years ago before consumption had taken her and left Zara alone in the world. The words were in a language Zara had never fully learned, passed down through her mother's family from somewhere far across the ocean, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful. It rose and fell like wind across prairie grass, carried notes of longing and hope and deep, abiding peace. Outside, Caleb had finished tying off the repaired section of fence and was coiling the remaining rope when the sound reached him. He froze, the rope forgotten in his hands as the song drifted out from the barn on the evening air. It was like nothing he had ever heard, beautiful and strange and so full of emotion that it made something crack in the fortress of ice he had built around his heart. Without consciously deciding to move, Caleb found himself walking toward the barn. He stopped at the partially open door, remaining in the shadows where Zara could not see him, and watched as she sang to his horses. The animals were completely entranced. Every single one of them had turned toward Zara, ears forward, eyes soft and focused. The bay gelding she was stroking had lowered his head until his muzzle rested against her shoulder, and his eyes were half closed in contentment. Even the more skittish horses, the ones who shied at sudden movements and distrusted human hands, were calm and attentive. Caleb had worked with horses his entire life. He knew how to handle them, how to train them, how to break them to saddle and bridle. But he had never seen anything like this. Zara was not controlling the horses or dominating them. She was simply sharing something with them, offering them a gift of beauty and peace, and they responded to it with complete trust. The song ended, fading into silence, and for a long moment the only sound was the soft breathing of the horses and the whistle of wind through the barn's eaves. Zara pressed her forehead against the bay's neck, and Caleb saw her shoulders tremble slightly. "Thank you," she whispered to the horse. "Thank you for listening. I have not had anyone to sing to in so long." Caleb stepped back from the door before she could turn and see him. His heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and he felt shaken in a manner he could not name or understand. Something about that song, about the raw emotion in her voice, had reached past every defense he had built and touched something he thought had died years ago. He returned to the ranch house, but for the first time in longer than he could remember, he could not lose himself in the mindless routine of his evening chores. He kept hearing that melody, kept seeing the way the horses had responded to her, kept thinking about the tears he had seen in her eyes when she thanked them for listening. Later that evening, after Caleb had shown Zara to the bunkhouse and left her with blankets and firewood and instructions about where to find breakfast in the morning, he sat alone in his father's study and tried to read. The words blurred on the page. He gave up after half an hour and went to bed, but sleep was a long time coming. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made metal burn to the touch. Caleb was up before sunrise, as always, and had the stove going and coffee brewing by the time pale light began to creep across the frozen landscape. He was surprised when he looked out the kitchen window and saw smoke already rising from the bunkhouse chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows. Zara appeared at the ranch house door just as the sun broke over the eastern mountains. She had clearly made an effort to make herself presentable, her hair braided back, and her clothing as neat as someone traveling with limited possessions could manage. "Morning," she said when Caleb opened the door. "I was not sure what you wanted me to start with, so I thought I would ask rather than assume." Caleb gestured for her to come inside out of the cold. "Coffee first, then I will show you around and we will figure out where you will be most useful." They sat at the rough wooden table in the kitchen, and Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Zara wrapped her hands around the cup gratefully, letting the warmth seep into her chilled fingers. "How did you end up in Idaho in the middle of winter?" Caleb asked, the question emerging before he could stop it. He generally made a point of not prying into people's personal affairs, but something about Zara made him curious despite himself. Zara was quiet for a moment, staring into her coffee. "I was in Oregon," she finally said. "I had been working on a ranch there, but the owner sold the property and the new owner did not want to keep me on. I heard there was work to be had in the mining towns in Idaho, so I headed this way. But by the time I got to Challies, I realized I did not want to work in a mining camp. I know ranches, I know animals, so I asked around town and someone mentioned your father might be hiring. You said you can work with horses. Where did you learn?" "My father was a horse trader," Zara said, and there was warmth in her voice when she spoke of him. "He traveled all over, buying and selling horses, and I went with him from the time I was old enough to sit a saddle. He taught me everything he knew. He died 2 years ago, and I have been working on ranches ever since, trying to keep doing the work I love." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood loss, even if he did not know how to respond to it with anything resembling comfort. "We have about 60 head of cattle and 20 horses. The cattle mostly take care of themselves this time of year, though we need to check on them regular and make sure they are not getting into trouble. The horses are the main work right now. They need to be fed, watered, exercised when weather permits. Some of them need training. I have a few I am working to break to saddle." "I can help with that," Zara said. "I am good with green horses." They finished their coffee and Caleb led Zara out to begin the day's work. He showed her the feed schedule, the tack room, the pastures where the cattle grazed when weather permitted. Zara absorbed everything quickly, asking intelligent questions and offering observations that showed she knew what she was talking about. As the morning progressed, Caleb found himself watching her when he thought she was not paying attention. She moved around the animals with a natural grace, never rushed or aggressive, always calm and confident. The horses responded to her immediately, even the ones that gave Caleb trouble. She had a way of approaching them that put them at ease, and within an hour of starting work, she had groomed and fed all 20 horses while Caleb dealt with breaking ice off the water troughs. Around midday, Zara asked if she could turn a few of the horses out into the small paddock next to the barn for exercise. Caleb agreed and stood watching as she led out 3 of the younger horses, animals who had been cooped up too long and were full of restless energy. As soon as the horses were loose in the paddock, they exploded into motion, bucking and running and kicking up sprays of snow. Zara laughed and climbed up to sit on the fence rail, watching them with obvious delight. And then, as naturally as breathing, she began to sing. It was a different song than the one Caleb had heard the night before, this one more upbeat and playful. The horses' ears swiveled toward her even as they continued to run, and gradually their wild racing took on a pattern, as if they were dancing to the melody she provided. They circled the paddock in time with the song, tossing their heads and prancing, their previous frantic energy transformed into something that looked almost choreographed. Caleb stood transfixed, watching this impossible display. He had never seen horses move like that, with such joy and freedom yet also in harmony with the woman singing to them. It was like watching something wild and beautiful that should not exist in the harsh reality of ranch life, a glimpse of magic in the mundane world. The song ended and the horses gradually slowed, their energy spent in a healthy way rather than the neurotic pacing that often came from too much confinement. They gathered near the fence where Zara sat, breathing hard but calm, and she reached out to stroke whichever noses came within reach. "Good boys," she murmured. "That felt good, did it not? Better than being cooped up in a stall all day." Caleb approached slowly, not wanting to startle the horses now that they were calm. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, and was surprised to hear genuine curiosity in his own voice rather than his usual flat effect. Zara glanced at him, a slight smile on her lips. "Do what? Sing to them like that? The way they respond to you, I have never seen anything like it." She shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "My mother used to sing all the time. She said music was the language the world spoke before words, and animals understand it better than people do sometimes. I started singing to my father's horses when I was little, and they always seem to like it. It calms them, makes them happy, I think." "It is remarkable," Caleb said, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. He could not remember the last time he had offered anyone a genuine compliment. Zara's smile widened. "They are remarkable. Horses are honest in a way people often are not. If they like you, they show it. If they do not trust you, they show that too. There is no pretense with them. Caleb thought about that as he helped her herd the horses back into the barn. There was a wisdom in what she said, an understanding of animal nature that went beyond mere training or handling. Zara did not just work with horses. She understood them on a level that Caleb, for all his years of experience, had never quite reached. The days began to fall into a pattern. Caleb and Zara worked together managing the ranch, their roles complementing each other naturally. Caleb handled the heavy physical labor and the business aspects of running the property, while Zara took over most of the horse care. The animals thrived under her attention, becoming noticeably calmer and more responsive. Every evening, after the day's work was done, Zara would spend an hour in the barn singing to the horses. And every evening, Caleb found reasons to be near the barn door, listening from the shadows. He told himself he was just checking that everything was secure for the night, that he was making sure the horses were properly settled. But the truth he would not admit even to himself was that he craved those moments, needed to hear that voice carrying music and emotion into the cold night air. Something was changing in Caleb Crawford, some ice beginning to crack and thaw. He found himself thinking about Zara at odd moments during the day, wondering what she thought about things, wanting to hear her laugh. He started making extra coffee in the mornings, because he knew she would come to the house to discuss the day's work. He began to notice small things, like the way she braided her hair differently when it was going to be a particularly cold day, or the way she hummed under her breath when she was concentrating on a task. It terrified him. These feelings, this warmth spreading through his chest when she smiled at him, this ache when she disappeared into the bunkhouse for the night, and he returned to his empty ranch house. He did not know what to do with any of it. His father had taught him that emotions were weakness, that caring about anything too much gave the world power to hurt you. Caleb had built his entire adult life around that philosophy, constructing walls of ice to keep everything and everyone at a distance. But Zara's singing was melting those walls whether he wanted them melted or not. One evening in late February, nearly 3 weeks after Zara had arrived, Caleb was working in the barn repairing a saddle when she finished singing and approached him. The horses were all settled for the night, breathing soft and rhythmic in their stalls. "Caleb," she said, and he looked up from his work to find her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, setting down the leather strap he had been mending. "Why do you never smile? I have been here almost a month and I have never seen you smile. Not once." The question caught him completely off guard. He stared at her, unable to formulate a response that made any sense. Finally he said, "I never thought about it." "Does nothing make you happy?" Zara pressed, moving closer. "Nothing at all." Caleb looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "I am not unhappy," he said carefully. "I just do not feel things the way other people seem to. My father always said I had ice water in my veins instead of blood. He was probably right." "I do not believe that," Zara said firmly. "I think you feel things very deeply. I think you have just buried it all so far down that you have forgotten how to let it out." "You do not know me well enough to make that judgment," Caleb said, and heard the defensive edge in his own voice. "Maybe not," Zara acknowledged, "but I see the way you care for the animals. I see how you maintain this ranch all by yourself, how hard you work. People who do not feel anything do not work that hard. They do not care about anything enough to put in that kind of effort." Caleb stood abruptly, the saddle forgotten. "I should get back to the house. Early start tomorrow." He left the barn before Zara could say anything else, his heart pounding and his hands shaking slightly. She had gotten too close, seen too much. The walls he had spent years building were crumbling, and he did not know how to stop it or even if he wanted to stop it. That night he lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind howl around the eaves of the ranch house. He thought about his father, about the man who had raised him with such rigid discipline and emotional coldness. Thomas Crawford had loved his son in his own way, Caleb supposed, but it was a love that manifested as harsh lessons and impossible standards. Emotions were beaten out of Caleb early and often, until he learned to simply stop feeling things rather than suffer the consequences of showing weakness. But what if Zara was right? What if all those feelings were still there, just buried deep where they could not hurt him? And if that was true, what did it mean that they were starting to surface now? The next morning brought an unexpected warm spell, one of those strange February days where the sun shone bright, and the temperature climbed high enough that snow began to melt and drip from the barn roof. Caleb suggested they use the opportunity to move the cattle to better grazing, and Zara agreed enthusiastically. They saddled horses and rode out together across the winter-brown prairie, following the small herd as it ambled toward pastures Caleb knew would have better grass. It was the first time they had really ridden together, and Caleb was impressed by Zara's horsemanship. She sat her mount with easy confidence, moving with the animal rather than against it, clearly comfortable with long hours in the saddle. As they rode, Zara began to sing again, and this time Caleb did not hide his listening. He rode beside her and let the music wash over him, and something in his chest loosened further. The horses beneath them pricked their ears forward, walking more smoothly as if the song made their burden lighter. "Your mother must have been an amazing woman," Caleb said when Zara paused between songs, "to give you such a gift." Zara smiled, but there was sadness in it. "She was. She died when I was 12, and I still miss her every day. But I have the songs she taught me, and as long as I can sing them, she is not entirely gone." "My mother died when I was 8, Caleb found himself saying, the words emerging before he could think better of them. "I barely remember her now. Just fragments, the sound of her laugh. The way she smelled like lavender. The fact that she used to sing too, though I cannot remember any of the songs." Zara reached across the space between their horses and briefly squeezed his hand. The gesture was simple, meant only as comfort, but it sent a shock through Caleb's entire body. When was the last time anyone had touched him with affection? Years, certainly, possibly more than a decade. "I am sorry," Zara said softly. "That must have been very hard, especially being raised by a father who did not believe in emotions." "He did what he thought was right," Caleb said, surprising himself by defending the man who had made his childhood such a cold and lonely thing. "He was preparing me to survive in a hard world, to run this ranch and make a living." "And you do," Zara pointed out. "You survive very well." "But Caleb, there is more to life than just surviving. There is supposed to be joy too. Love, music and laughter and all the things that make survival worth the effort." They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one. Caleb thought about what she had said, turning the words over in his mind. Was she right? Had he been so focused on surviving, on meeting his father's impossible standards even after the man was dead, that he had forgotten how to actually live? The work with the cattle took most of the day, and by the time they rode back to the ranch, the sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and pink across the western sky. They unsaddled and groomed the horses together, working in companionable quiet, and Caleb found himself not wanting the day to end. "Zara," he said as she was heading toward the bunkhouse. She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Would you like to have dinner at the house tonight?" "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage stew and biscuits," The smile that lit up her face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. I would like that very much. They ate together at the kitchen table, and for the first time in longer than Caleb could remember, the ranch house did not feel like a tomb of silence and loneliness. Zara filled the space with stories from her travels with her father, tales of the places they had been and the horses they had traded. She made Caleb laugh, an actual genuine laugh that surprised him as much as it seemed to delight her. "There it is," she said, grinning at him across the table. "I knew you could smile. You should do it more often. It transforms your whole face." Caleb felt heat rise in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation. Was he actually blushing? "I am out of practice," he admitted. "Then we will have to get you back in practice," Zara said firmly. "Starting now." "Tell me something that makes you happy." Caleb thought about it, really thought about it. "Horses," he finally said. "When you get a young horse trained just right and you can feel them start to trust you, start to understand what you are asking, that sense of partnership, I like that." "What else?" "Sunrise in summer when the whole prairie turns gold, coffee when it is made just right, the sound of rain on the barn roof." He paused, then added quietly, "You're singing. I like listening to you sing to the horses." Zara's expression softened. "I know," she said gently. "I have seen you standing by the barn door. I did not say anything because I did not want to embarrass you, but I am glad you listen. Music is meant to be shared." They talked deep into the night, the fire in the stove burning down to embers as they shared pieces of their lives with each other. Caleb found himself opening up in ways he never had before, telling Zara about his childhood, about his mother's death and his father's harsh discipline, about the loneliness of the past year since his father died, living alone in this big house with only his own silent company. Zara listened without judgment, and when he finished talking, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You do not have to be alone anymore," she said. "I am here now, for as long as you want me to be." Caleb looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers laced through his with such natural ease. "What if I do not know how to not be alone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I am too damaged, too cold?" "You are not cold," Zara said firmly. "You are careful, and that is different. Your father hurt you by teaching you that feelings were weakness, but he was wrong. Feelings are what make us human. They are what give life meaning." She squeezed his hand. "And I do not think you are as frozen as you believe. Ice does not thaw overnight, but I can already see cracks forming. Give yourself time." That night, when Zara finally left for the bunkhouse, Caleb stood at his bedroom window and watched the lamplight in her window until it went out. Something had shifted between them over dinner. Some barrier had fallen. He was falling for this woman who sang to horses and saw through his carefully constructed walls. It terrified him and thrilled him in equal measure. March arrived with a late blizzard that dumped 2 feet of snow across the region and trapped them on the ranch for nearly a week. Caleb and Zara worked together to keep the animals fed and safe, fighting through drifts to reach the barn and making sure the cattle had access to water and shelter. It was hard, exhausting work, but Caleb found he did not mind it because Zara was there beside him, laughing at the absurdity of the weather and singing to keep their spirits up as they battled the storm. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, as they were trudging back to the house after feeding the horses, Zara slipped on a patch of ice hidden under the snow. Caleb caught her before she could fall, his arms going around her waist to steady her, and suddenly they were standing pressed together in the swirling snow, faces inches apart. Time seemed to stop. Caleb looked into Zara's eyes and saw warmth and affection and something deeper, something that made his heart race. Without thinking, moving on pure instinct, he leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was gentle and tentative, The kiss of a man who had no practice at this, who did not know if he was doing it right. But Zara responded by wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him back. And suddenly, Caleb did not care if he was doing it right because nothing had ever felt so perfectly correct as having Zara in his arms. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Zara smiled up at him with eyes full of joy. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice teasing but warm. "I did not know if you wanted me to," Caleb admitted. "I did not know if you felt the same way I do. And how do you feel?" Zara asked, reaching up to cup his cold, reddened cheek with her hand. Caleb took a deep breath, forcing himself to be brave enough to speak truth. "Like ice is melting and I am terrified, but I do not want it to stop. Like you have brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead. Like I am falling in love with you, and I do not know how to do that, but I want to learn." Zara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she said simply. "I have been falling for you since the first day I arrived and saw past that cold exterior to the man underneath. You have so much warmth in you, Caleb. You just needed someone to help you remember how to let it out." They stood in the snow, holding each other as the blizzard raged around them, and Caleb felt something fundamental shift in his soul. He was not alone anymore. He was not frozen anymore. Zara had melted the ice with her songs and her laughter and her gentle patience, and now he was finally, truly alive for the first time since childhood. The blizzard eventually passed, as all storms do, and spring began its slow arrival in the Idaho mountains. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green, and the days grew longer and warmer. Caleb and Zara's relationship deepened as the season changed, growing from tentative new love into something solid and enduring. They were inseparable now, working together during the day and spending their evenings at the ranch house, cooking dinner together and talking for hours by the fire. Caleb taught Zara how to rope cattle and mend fences, skills she had not quite mastered in her travels. Zara taught Caleb her songs, patient with his fumbling attempts to carry a tune, delighted when he started to hum along with her as they worked. The horses thrived under their combined care. Caleb brought his knowledge of training, and Zara brought her gift for connection. And together they transformed the ranch's string from a collection of working animals into true partners. Word began to spread in Challies about the Crawford ranch's excellent horses, and Caleb found himself with more buyers than he had anticipated when spring horse trading season arrived. One evening in early April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Caleb took Zara's hand and cleared his throat nervously. "I have been thinking," he began, then paused, trying to find the right words. This was important, maybe the most important thing he had ever said, and he wanted to get it right. "Always dangerous," Zara teased gently, squeezing his hand. "I want you to stay," Caleb said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not as hired help. I want you to stay as my wife if you will have me. I know I am not good at this, at talking about feelings and being open, but I am trying. I love you, Zara. You brought me back to life. You showed me there was more to the world than just surviving. I cannot imagine going back to the way things were before you came. I do not want to." Zara was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb felt panic begin to rise. Had he misread everything? Was she going to say no? But then he saw the tears streaming down her face and the brilliant smile that accompanied them. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, of course I will marry you. I love you, Caleb Crawford. I love the man you are and the man you are becoming. I would be honored to be your wife." Caleb pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and in that moment, he sent a silent thank you to whatever force in the universe had sent Zara to his ranch in the middle of winter. She had saved him from a half-life of cold isolation. She had given him a future he had never dared to imagine. They were married in Challis on a warm day in late May, in a simple ceremony at the church with a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Zara wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Caleb had bought her in town, pale blue cotton that matched the spring sky. Caleb wore his best suit, the one his father had been buried in, though he had it altered to fit him properly. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed his bride with a joy and abandon that would have shocked anyone who knew him a few months earlier. The cold, silent man who had lived like a ghost in his own life was gone. In his place was someone learning to feel, to love, to live fully. They held a small celebration at the ranch afterward, with food and music and dancing. Zara sang for the gathered guests, her voice soaring up into the spring evening, and Caleb watched her with his heart so full he thought it might burst. This was his wife. This incredible woman with music in her soul had chosen him, had seen past his frozen exterior to the man who could love and be loved. That night, alone in the ranch house that was now truly a home, Caleb and Zara consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. Caleb had been nervous, uncertain in his inexperience, but Zara guided him with patience and love, and together they discovered the joy of physical intimacy alongside the emotional connection they had already built. Afterward, lying tangled together in the bed that had once been Caleb's solitary refuge, Zara traced patterns on his chest and hummed one of her songs. Caleb felt peace settle over him like a warm blanket, a sense of rightness and belonging he had never experienced before. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "For what?" Zara asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "For not giving up on me, for seeing something in me worth saving, for teaching me how to feel again." Zara smiled and kissed his jaw. "You did not need saving, Caleb. You just needed someone to remind you that you were already whole. The warmth was always there. I just helped you remember how to let it out." The months that followed were the happiest of Caleb's life. He and Zara ran the ranch together as true partners, their skills complementing each other perfectly. The business thrived under their combined efforts. The horses Zara trained with her singing, and Caleb's horsemanship became sought after throughout the territory, and they were able to expand their operation significantly. But more than the business success, it was the small daily joys that transformed Caleb's existence. Waking up next to Zara each morning and seeing her smile, cooking breakfast together and stealing kisses between turning pancakes, working side by side during the day and knowing that at evening's end they would return to each other's arms. He learned to laugh freely, to express affection without fear, to let himself feel the full spectrum of human emotion without believing it made him weak. Zara continued to sing to the horses every evening, but now Caleb joined her in the barn openly, sitting on a hay bale and listening without hiding. Sometimes he would join in on the songs he had learned, his rough baritone blending with her clear soprano in harmonies that made the horses prick their ears and blow contentedly. By autumn, Zara discovered she was pregnant. She shared the news with Caleb one September evening as they sat on the porch watching the leaves begin to turn gold and red on the cottonwoods along the creek. "We are going to have a baby," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "In the spring, around April or May." Caleb felt tears spring to his eyes, something that would have been impossible for him to imagine a year earlier. "A baby," he repeated, awestruck. "We are going to be parents." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Zara said firmly. "Nothing like your own father. You will teach our children to feel, to love, to embrace life with open hearts." "I do not know how to be a father," Caleb admitted, fear creeping into his voice. What if I do it wrong? What if I am too cold, too damaged? Zara turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. Listen to me, Caleb Crawford. You are one of the warmest, most loving men I have ever known. You were hurt and taught to hide it, but you have spent the past year learning to open your heart again. Our children will be raised with love and music and laughter. They will know they are cherished. And yes, you will make mistakes because all parents do, but you will make them from a place of love, and that makes all the difference. Caleb pulled her close and held her tight, letting her words wash over him and take root. She believed in him. She trusted him with the life growing inside her. He would not let her down. He would be the father he wished he had had, the kind of parent who encouraged rather than crushed, who nurtured rather than froze. Winter came again to the Idaho mountains, but this year it did not feel harsh or isolating to Caleb. The ranch house was warm and full of life, with Zara's presence filling every corner with light and music. They spent the cold months preparing for the baby, converting one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery and stocking up on supplies for the spring arrival. Zara's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Caleb marveled at the changes in her body, the visible proof of the life they had created together. He became almost obsessively protective, worrying about her lifting heavy objects or working too hard. But Zara laughed at his concerns and continued to help with the horses until she became too large to move comfortably. Even unable to do the physical work, she still sang to the horses every evening, and Caleb would lead her out to the barn and settle her on a comfortable seat where she could croon to the animals who loved her voice. The horses seemed to understand something special was happening, becoming even gentler around Zara, as if they knew to be careful with her. In late April, on a night when the spring peepers were singing in the creek, and the air smelled of new grass and apple blossoms, Zara's labor began. Caleb rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from Challies, his heart pounding with fear and excitement in equal measure. By the time they returned, Zara's contractions were strong and regular. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Caleb stayed by Zara's side the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with cool cloths, feeling helpless in the face of her pain but refusing to leave her for even a moment. "Sing to me," Zara gasped between contractions. "Sing one of the songs I taught you." Caleb's voice was rough and uncertain, but he began to sing the lullaby Zara had taught him months earlier, the one her mother used to sing to her. As his voice filled the bedroom, Zara seemed to relax slightly, drawing strength from the familiar melody. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, their son was born. The midwife placed the squalling infant on Zara's chest, and Caleb looked down at the tiny red-faced creature they had created and felt his heart expand in ways he had not known were possible. "We have a son," Zara said, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "Caleb, look at him. He is perfect." Caleb reached out with a trembling hand to touch the baby's impossibly small fingers, and the infant's hand closed around his thumb with surprising strength. Something profound shifted in Caleb's soul in that moment. This was his child, his son, a person he would love and protect and raise to be everything Caleb himself had been denied the chance to be. "What should we name him?" Zara asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at this new life they had brought into the world, Caleb knew exactly what felt right. "Clayton," he said. "Clayton James Crawford, after your father and mine, but he will be his own person." "We will make sure of that." Zara smiled and kissed Clayton's downy head. "Clayton James Crawford, welcome to the world, little one. You are so loved." The midwife stayed for a few days to make sure both mother and baby were recovering well, then returned to Challies with promises to check on them in a week. Caleb and Zara were left alone with their son, learning the rhythms of new parenthood together. It was exhausting and overwhelming and absolutely wonderful. Caleb had never been so tired in his life, but he had also never been so happy. He would stand by Clayton's cradle in the middle of the night, watching the baby sleep, marveling that this perfect little human existed because he and Zara loved each other. Zara would sing to Clayton constantly, the same songs she sang to the horses, and the baby would calm immediately at the sound of her voice. Caleb learned to sing them too, rocking his son in the rocking chair they had placed in the nursery, his rough voice carrying melodies that had once been foreign to him, but now felt like home. As Clayton grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Caleb and Zara had hired additional help to manage the expanding operation, but they remained hands-on with the horses, which had become their specialty. People came from all over the territory to buy Crawford horses, known for their excellent training and unusually calm temperaments. Clayton grew up surrounded by horses and music, learning to walk by holding onto stall doors and falling asleep to his mother's lullabies. He was a happy child, quick to laugh and affectionate, and Caleb marveled daily at the miracle of having created this joyful little person. When Clayton was 2 years old, Zara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because they knew what to expect, and in the spring of 1887 their daughter was born. They named her Lily Rose, and she came into the world with her mother's amber eyes and a surprisingly loud voice for such a tiny creature. Caleb held his daughter for the first time and felt the same overwhelming rush of love he had experienced with Clayton. His family was growing, his heart was full, and the cold, isolated man he had once been seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work and deep contentment. Caleb watched his children grow, teaching Clayton to ride and rope, listening to Zara teach Lily the songs her own mother had taught her. He had become the father he had always needed, patient and affectionate, quick to praise and slow to criticize. The ranch became known not just for its excellent horses, but also for the warm hospitality of its owners. Travelers passing through would often stop for a meal and stay to listen to Zara sing, and many left talking about the Crawford family's obvious love for each other and the peaceful atmosphere that permeated the property. Caleb's transformation was so complete that the few people in Challies who had known him before Zara arrived could hardly believe he was the same man. The cold, silent rancher who never smiled had become someone warm and engaged, quick to laugh and generous with his time and resources. Those who commented on the change were told simply that he had been fortunate enough to marry the right woman, but Caleb knew it was more than fortune. It was Zara's patience and love that had melted the ice his father had frozen around his heart. It was her singing that had called him back to life, her gentle insistence that he was worth saving, her unwavering belief that the capacity for warmth and love had always existed in him. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Zara stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Clayton, now 9 years old, was in the barn tending to his own horse, a gentle mare Zara had trained specifically for him. Lily, 7, sat on the porch steps singing to herself, her voice already showing the same pure quality her mother possessed. "You remember the first time I sang to the horses?" Zara asked, leaning against Caleb's shoulder. "And you stood at the barn door listening, thinking I could not see you." Caleb laughed and wrapped his arm around her waist. I remember thinking I had never heard anything so beautiful. I remember feeling something crack inside me, like ice breaking up in spring. I was terrified and mesmerized all at once. I knew you were there, Zara admitted. I could feel you watching. I hoped the music would reach you, would help you understand that it was safe to feel things again. It did more than that, Caleb said seriously, turning to face her fully. It saved my life. I was not really living before you came, Zara. I was just existing, going through motions, frozen and alone. You taught me how to be human again, how to love and laugh and embrace life with open arms. Everything good in my life now exists because you refused to let me stay frozen. Zara smiled and reached up to cup his face, her thumb tracing the laugh lines that had appeared around his eyes over the years, evidence of a decade of happiness. You were never as frozen as you thought. The warmth was always there. I just turned up the heat a little. They kissed as the sun set behind the mountains, their children's voices drifting up from the yard where Clayton had joined Lily, and they were singing together. The horses in the barn nickered contentedly, settling in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Caleb thought about the man he had been, alone and cold and convinced he was incapable of feeling anything beyond the most basic emotions. That man had died the night Zara first sang to the horses, and Caleb listened from the barn door, unable to resist the call of her voice and the promise of warmth it offered. In his place stood a man who loved deeply and lived fully, who raised his children with affection and ran his ranch with his soulmate by his side. A man who sang lullabies to his babies and laughed at his wife's jokes and felt his heart swell with gratitude every single day for the gift of the life they had built together. The ice had melted completely, replaced by a warmth that would last the rest of his days. And it had all started with a song carried on the winter wind, sung by a woman who saw past his frozen exterior to the man who was desperate to feel again. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Caleb and Zara went inside to put their children to bed. Clayton needed to be reminded 3 times to actually get under the covers, instead of reading by lamplight, while Lily required 2 lullabies and a story before she would consent to sleep. When the children were finally settled, Caleb and Zara returned to their own bedroom, the room where they had shared so many nights of love and intimacy over the past decade. They made love slowly and tenderly, still learning new things about each other even after all these years, still finding joy in the physical expression of their emotional bond. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Zara's head on his chest and her hair spread across his shoulder, Caleb felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was what life was meant to be. Not the cold isolation of his youth, not the frozen half-existence he had settled for before Zara arrived. This warmth, this love, this sense of belonging and purpose. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone or anything. You are my miracle, Zara Crawford." "And you are mine," Zara whispered back, her breath warm against his skin. "My frozen cowboy who melted into the most wonderful man I have ever known. I love you, Caleb. Today, tomorrow, forever." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Caleb's dreams were full of music and sunshine, and the laughter of his children. The nightmares of isolation and cold that had plagued him for so many years were gone, banished by love and warmth, and the knowledge that he would never be alone again. The ranch continued to thrive as the years passed. Clayton grew into a responsible young man who shared his father's gift for working with horses and his mother's musical ability. He would often sing while training young horses, having learned from watching his parents that music and patience could accomplish more than force ever could. Lily developed into a beautiful young woman with her mother's amber eyes, and a singing voice that was, if anything, even more pure and lovely than Zara's. She began giving lessons to the children in Challies, teaching them the songs her grandmother had taught her mother, keeping the tradition alive for another generation. When Caleb was 45 and Zara 42, they became grandparents for the first time when Clayton married a kind young woman from town and had a daughter of his own. Caleb held his granddaughter and marveled at the continuing miracle of his life, at how far he had come from the frozen, emotionally barren man he had once been. "Your great-grandfather would not recognize me now," he told the sleeping infant. "He raised me to be hard and cold, to never show emotion or weakness. But your grandmother taught me that feelings are not weakness. Love is not weakness. And because I learned that lesson, you get to grow up in a family where affection is freely given and music fills the air and everyone knows they are cherished." Zara watched from the doorway, tears of joy streaming down her face. "You are a wonderful grandfather already," she said. "Just as you were a wonderful father. Thomas Crawford may have raised you with coldness, but you broke that cycle. You made sure our children and now our grandchildren know what real love looks like." As Caleb and Zara grew older together, their love only deepened. The passion of youth might have mellowed somewhat, but it was replaced by a profound intimacy that came from decades of shared experiences and unwavering partnership. They could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, finish each other's sentences, anticipate each other's needs without being asked. The ranch became legendary throughout Idaho and the surrounding territories. People would travel significant distances to buy Crawford horses, but also just to visit the ranch and experience the unusual atmosphere of peace and warmth that seemed to permeate the property. Many visitors commented that they had never seen a couple so obviously in love, even after so many years together. Zara continued to sing to the horses every evening, though as arthritis began to settle into her joints, Caleb would help her out to the barn and settle her comfortably before she began. The horses still responded to her voice with the same rapt attention they had shown decades earlier, and new horses added to the string quickly learned to love the sound of her singing. Caleb, now in his 60s, still worked the ranch daily, though he had turned over most of the heavy labor to younger hired hands and to Clayton, who had become a full partner in the operation. But he still made his rounds every morning and evening, checking on the animals and the property, unable to fully relinquish the habits of a lifetime. One evening in late summer, when the prairie grass was golden and the air smelled of dust and sage, Caleb and Zara sat on their porch watching another spectacular sunset. They had been married for nearly 40 years, and Caleb's hair was silver now. Zara's amber eyes framed by laugh lines and crow's feet earned through decades of smiling. "You remember the day I arrived?" Zara asked, her hand finding Caleb's and lacing their fingers together in the familiar gesture they had shared countless times. "I was so desperate, so afraid you would turn me away and I would have nowhere to go." "I remember thinking I should send you away," Caleb admitted. "I remember thinking I did not need another person around, that I was fine on my own. Thank God I was smart enough to hire you anyway. Thank God I was brave enough to sing that first night," Zara added. "I knew you were listening from the barn door. I could feel your presence even though you tried to hide. I hoped the music would reach past whatever walls you had built." "It did," Caleb said softly. "It reached right into the frozen core of me and started melting the ice. I fell in love with you while listening to you sing to the horses, though it took me weeks to admit it even to myself. You were so warm, so full of life and emotion, everything I had been taught not to be. You terrified me and fascinated me in equal measure." Zara squeezed his hand. "And now?" "Do I still terrify you?" Caleb laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Now you are my whole world, you and our children and grandchildren. The family we built together, the life we created. None of it would exist if you had not sung to the horses that night and melted the ice that ran through my veins." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. From the barn came the sound of their granddaughter singing to the horses, her young voice carrying the songs Zara had taught Lily, who had taught them in turn to the next generation. The tradition continued, the music lived on, the warmth spread ever outward. "I have been thinking," Zara said slowly, "about what happens next. We are getting older, Caleb. Neither of us will live forever." Caleb felt his chest tighten at the thought of losing her, but he forced himself to address it rather than push it away. That was what the old Caleb would have done, frozen Caleb who could not handle difficult emotions. The man he had become faced things honestly. "I know," he said. "The thought of existing without you is almost unbearable. But I also know that whatever time we have left, we will spend it together and fill it with as much love and joy as we can. And when one of us goes, the other will carry on, because that is what you taught me to do. To live fully, to embrace life even when it is hard, to never retreat back into the ice." "Promise me something," Zara said, turning to look at him with those amber eyes that still made his heart skip a beat after all these years. "Promise me that if I go first, you will not freeze again. Promise me you will stay warm, stay connected to our family, keep singing even if your voice cracks. Promise me you will live, really live, until your last breath." "I promise," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you have to promise me the same. If I go first, you keep singing. You keep teaching the grandchildren. You keep filling this ranch with music and warmth. You keep being the light you have always been." "I promise," Zara whispered, and they sealed the promises with a kiss that still carried echoes of the passion they had shared for 4 decades. As it happened, they were blessed with many more years together. They lived to see Clayton's daughter grow up and have children of her own, to see Lily marry and build a family that filled the old ranch house with noise and laughter during holidays. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by 3 generations of family, all of whom existed because a desperate woman had shown up in the middle of winter asking for work, and a frozen man had been smart enough to say yes. On their anniversary, as the whole family gathered for a celebration, Clayton stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that love is the opposite of weakness, that emotions are gifts to be cherished, and that the right person can transform your entire life. My father once told me that he had ice water in his veins until my mother came along and melted it with her singing. I am grateful every day that she did, because otherwise I would not exist, and I would not have learned what real love looks like." Caleb looked around at the faces gathered in his home, at the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled every corner with warmth and life. This was his legacy, not the ranch or the horses or any material thing. This family, this love, this warmth that had spread from the moment Zara sang to the horses and he listened from the barn door. When Caleb finally passed away at the age of 78, it was peacefully in his sleep with Zara beside him. He went to whatever came next with a heart full of love and a life fully lived, having transformed completely from the frozen, isolated young man into someone capable of deep feeling and profound connection. Zara mourned him deeply, but did not let grief freeze her. She kept her promise, staying warm and engaged with her family, continuing to teach the songs to anyone who wanted to learn. She lived 5 more years after Caleb's death, years filled with the love of her children and grandchildren, and the memories of the man who had been her partner and soulmate for over half a century. When Zara passed at the age of 81, it was in the spring when the prairie was green and the creek was running high with snowmelt. She was in the barn, having insisted on being brought out to sing to the horses one last time. As her great-granddaughter helped her settle on a chair in the center of the barn, Zara began to sing the first song she had ever sung in that barn, the one Caleb had heard from the barn door all those decades ago. The horses gathered close, every single one of them turning to face her, ears forward and eyes soft. Zara sang until her voice faded to a whisper, and then she closed her eyes and slipped away peacefully, surrounded by the animals she loved and the music that had defined her life. The family buried her next to Caleb on a hillside overlooking the ranch, under the shade of a cottonwood tree that had been planted the year they married. The gravestone was simple, bearing both their names and a single inscription. Ice ran through his veins until she sang to the horses. The cowboy listened from the barn door, and love melted everything. The ranch stayed in the Crawford family for generations after that, passed down from Clayton to his children, and then to theirs. The tradition of singing to the horses continued, taught by each generation to the next, a living legacy of the woman who had brought music and warmth to a frozen man and transformed his entire world. And sometimes, on quiet spring evenings when the wind was just right, ranch hands swore they could hear singing coming from the barn, a hauntingly beautiful voice carrying melodies from another time. The horses would prick their ears and turn toward the sound, calm and attentive, as if listening to a beloved friend. The old-timers in Challies would smile when they heard such stories and say it was Zara, still singing to the horses she loved. And maybe they were right. Maybe love that profound could not be contained by something as simple as death. Maybe it lived on in the songs passed down through generations, in the warmth that still filled the ranch house, in every person who learned that ice could melt and frozen hearts could learn to beat again. Caleb Crawford had been saved by a song sung to horses, and a woman brave enough to see past his frozen exterior to the man desperate to feel again. He had lived a life transformed by love, had raised children and grandchildren who understood that emotions were strength rather than weakness, had built a legacy that would last long after he was gone. And it had all started on a cold February day in 1883, when a desperate woman asked for work, and a frozen man said yes. When she sang to the horses that first night, and he listened from the barn door, unable to resist the call of music and warmth and the promise of something better than the cold isolation he had known, the ice had melted. Love had won. And the music played on forever, a testament to the power of one woman's voice to transform one man's frozen heart into something warm and alive, and capable of the deepest love imaginable. The story of Caleb and Zara became legend in those parts, told and retold until it was impossible to separate fact from embellishment. But the core truth remained unchanged through every telling. That love can reach the most frozen heart, that music can heal the deepest wounds, and that it is never too late to melt the ice and learn to live with warmth and passion and joy. Their great-great-grandchildren still run the Crawford Ranch today, still raise horses with patience and music, still teach the songs Zara brought with her on that cold February day so many years ago. And when they sing to the horses in the evening, when the light is golden and the air is still, they sometimes feel the presence of their ancestors, the frozen cowboy and the woman who sang him back to life, watching over the legacy they created together. The ranch remains a place of warmth and welcome, where visitors comment on the unusual peace that seems to permeate the property, where the horses are known for their calm temperaments and willing partnerships with humans. People still travel from far away to experience the Crawford Ranch, drawn by stories of horses trained with music and a family legacy built on love. And every single person who works with the Crawford horses, whether family or hired help, learns the tradition of singing to the animals in the evening. It is not optional, not a quaint custom that can be abandoned when it becomes inconvenient. It is the soul of the place, the living heart of the legacy Zara and Caleb built together, because they proved, through 5 decades of marriage and a lifetime of love, that even the coldest heart can melt. That ice can become water, flowing and warm and full of life. That one person brave enough to sing can change the entire trajectory of another person's existence. That love is always worth the risk of feeling, worth the vulnerability of opening your frozen heart and letting warmth in. Caleb Crawford learned this lesson from Zara Winters, and in learning it, he became someone capable of teaching it to his children and their children after them. The ice that once ran through his veins became the warmth that filled an entire family, spreading outward in ripples that touched countless lives over the generations. And it had all started with a song, with a woman singing to horses in a barn, with a man listening from the door, frozen heart beginning to crack and thaw, with the first tentative steps toward warmth after a lifetime of cold. That is the power of love. That is the power of music. That is the power of one brave woman who refused to accept that any man was truly frozen beyond redemption. Zara had seen the warmth buried deep inside Caleb Crawford, and she had sung to it until it could no longer hide. She had melted the ice with patience and persistence, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves to feel the full range of human emotion. And Caleb, for his part, had been brave enough to let her. Brave enough to let the walls crumble, to let the ice melt, to risk feeling things after so many years of numbness. Together, they had created something beautiful from the ruins of his frozen past, built a future full of warmth and love and music that would echo through generations. The Crawford Ranch still stands today, testament to their love and the legacy they left behind. The barn where Zara first sang still shelters horses who respond to music as if it is their native language. The house where Caleb learned to laugh and cry and love still rings with the voices of family gatherings. The land they worked together still produces some of the finest horses in the state. But more than any physical legacy, Caleb and Zara left behind the knowledge that transformation is always possible. That ice can melt. That frozen hearts can learn to beat with warmth and passion. That love, when it is real and true and deep, can overcome any obstacle and heal any wound. This is the story of how ice ran through his veins until she sang to the horses, and the cowboy listened from the barn door. It is a story of transformation and redemption, of music and horses, of two people who found each other across the gulf of his frozen isolation and built a bridge of love that would last forever. And somewhere in the Idaho mountains, on quiet spring evenings when the light is golden and the wind carries the scent of sage and wildflowers, you can still hear singing drifting from the Crawford Ranch barn. The horses turn toward the sound, ears forward and eyes soft, listening to melodies that have been sung in that place for over a century. Listen carefully, and you might hear two voices blending in harmony, a clear soprano and a rough baritone, singing together as they did in life, as they will for all eternity. The frozen cowboy and the woman who melted his heart, united forever in music and love and the warmth that conquered the ice. Their story reminds us all that it is never too late to thaw, never too late to feel, never too late to let love in. No matter how frozen we have become, no matter how many walls we have built, or how much ice runs through our veins, there is always hope. Always the possibility that the right person will come along with the right song, and everything will change. Caleb Crawford found that person in Zara Winters, and she found in him a man worth saving, worth loving, worth spending a lifetime beside. Together they proved that love can conquer anything, even a heart that has been frozen for decades. Together they built a legacy that will endure as long as there are horses to sing to and people brave enough to listen from barn doors, hearts open to the possibility of warmth. This is their story. This is their legacy. This is the truth that echoes through generations of the Crawford family. That ice ran through his veins until she sang to the horses. The cowboy listened from the barn door, and love melted everything in its path, leaving only warmth and light and music in its wake.